Hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to be looking at some of the basic theory pertaining to Gothic horror and horror films that will underlie our considerations of monsters in this course. You already have a third text to read, Carroll's Paradoxes of the Heart, that we'll be studying and discussing in our interactive class on Friday. However, this series of video lectures deals with some other ancillary details that will help to ground the more specific conversation about monsters that Carroll provides. In this video lecture, we'll be looking at Gothic, or the Literary Gothic, and Gothic Horror. These are specific genres of literature. Not all of the stories that we study, in fact, very few of the stories that we study, will be embedded in this genre or participate in this genre, but the codes and conventions of this form of literature will see expression in many of the different texts that we study, because the monsters and creatures of Gothic horror or Gothic literature are very much akin to those that we'll be encountering in these works. We'll also have a brief discussion of Stephen King, probably the most prolific and famous author of horror literature in the contemporary world, and his comments on the fascination with horror films evidenced by our culture. All of this will lead us into our interactive class conversation on Paradoxes of the Heart. First, we have to understand something about what Gothic entails and what the Gothic means. Gothic is a kind of period or descriptor for the works produced in that historical period. Of architecture, it refers primarily to 12th century French architecture, typical of that which we see in the cathedrals depicted in these illustrations. Um, Gothic architecture is defined by elaborate and extensive stained glass windows, extensive statuary, vast ornate pieces, flying buttresses, so those buttresses that support the building from the outside and have these curved, arched formations that extends from the upper portion of a pier or the structure of the building to the ground, such that it can support the weight of the building and leave the interior without those standard buttresses. Now, you can see from these illustrations that the Gothic form in architecture, and this is not something we're getting into in detail, it's not an architecture course, but it's just an illustrated example, is incredibly ornate and resplendent, and the beauty comes from the intricacy of the designs. Gothic literature follows a similar kind of pattern. Talk a little bit more about that. But as flying buttresses, you see those depicted here. Gothic literature functions in a fashion similar to this kind of architecture, in that it is defined by its elaborate and ornate structures. The literary Gothic evolved in predominantly the 18th century. Gothic fiction has a subgenre known as Gothic horror. It's a genre of literature that focuses on the interplay between horror, romance, and death. So, some of the most famous works of Gothic horror would be something like Wuthering Heights, about a woman who is confined to this, well, Gothic manor house with its ornate, intricate structures both inside and out. It has innumerable hidden rooms and secret passages. There's some kind of terrible mystery inside of it, and the Gothic novel that surrounds this manor house, Wuthering Heights, and it features Gothic architecture. And many of these Gothic horror narratives take place in those stereotypical haunted houses, defined by that kind of construction. One of the distinguishing features of Gothic horror is its grounding in realism. There's a concern in these texts to ensure a kind of verisimilitude, believability, or reasonability in the stories, such that they are, in a sense, true to life. Authors of the Gothic attempted to eschew humor or comedic elements and also ground the supernatural and the fantastical in realism in order to emphasize the horror of these pieces. Now, when I say that these works are romantic in inclination, I'm using that term in a very specific sense pertaining to the literary form or movement known as Romanticism. I'm going to talk about that for just a minute in order to ground what I have to say about the literary Gothic. Romanticism, as an aesthetic and artistic movement, is not about romance as in love per se. It can include romance, certainly, but that's not the point of Romanticism. Romanticism is more about a romanticization of feeling itself. This is not a history course and it's not a course about Romanticism, but in general, in the most broad brush terms, in order to understand the literary Gothic and get into these conventions that we'll be dealing with in this course, Romanticism is a kind of outgrowth of the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was a period in the 17th and 18th centuries, also known as the Age of Enlightenment or the Age of Reason or just the Enlightenment. It was a moment in history that was dominated by certain philosophical presumptions and the evolution of a scientific understanding of the world that was based in Renaissance humanism. So, through the Renaissance, you have this evolution of, let's say, academies of learning and scientific approaches to the world, and a more humanistic sentiment. So, you're grounding moral beliefs and presumptions about the value of human life or about our perspectives on the world, not in a kind of divine framework or religious framework, but in a humanistic one. And again, this is not a course in philosophy, so we're not going to delve into what that really entails, but it's a shift away from divine conceptions of the universe or religious conceptions of the universe to more scientifically oriented, empiricist perspectives on the world that correlated with the scientific revolution. The Age of Enlightenment, or just the Enlightenment, proceeds from these evolutions in the understanding or major philosophical presumptions about the world. This period elevated and glorified things like rationalism, the primacy of the human being, the control over and suppression of the emotions and of emotional excesses in favor of that rationality, and that shift away from religious and spiritual matters to empirical things, things that can be tested, weighed, and measured through the physical sciences and through the senses. Romanticism, as a movement in philosophy and primarily art, arose as a counter movement to the Enlightenment. Again, we're speaking in very broad brush terms here, but it privileged things like the spontaneous overflow of emotion and rebelled against the kind of sterile, cold, intellectual values of the Enlightenment. The reason of things, about essentially scientism, the belief that science has answers to life's major questions, that the only way that we can gain knowledge in the world is through the scientific method. As a result, it focuses on the subjective, spontaneous overflow of emotion and the creation of meaning from that subjective perspective. Romanticism is all about feeling and beauty. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of the poets of Romanticism, has this to say about the movement. I have said before that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin in emotion recollected in tranquility. So, in those moments of peace where you're simply observing the world and living in the moment, you are able to produce this spontaneous overflow of emotion. The emotion is contemplated until, by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappears. So, in other words, you have that moment of tranquility where you experience this overflow of emotion, but you lose it because the more you think about it, the more you are consciously aware of what you're feeling and why, and thus try to recreate it, let's say, in your art. I know I'm feeling this way, I know what made me feel this way, so maybe I can capture that feeling in art. The more that you try to do that, the more it slips from your fingers because emotion has to be spontaneous. It's not something you can categorize and rationalize. That tranquility disappears, and, Coleridge goes on to say, quote, and an emotion kindred to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. So, here we have in the romantic mind, or the mind of a romantic poet, this idea that there's an excess of emotion, an experience beyond the norm, of the everyday. That is what he would call, or what the Romantics would call, the sublime. An experience of a grandeur, a sense of awed listening, of wonder in the face of something so tremendously beautiful, so tremendously beyond prosaic, common human experience, that it leaves us speechless, stupefied. In a sense, in that moment of quote unquote the sublime, you experience something that is both grandiose and almost grotesque because it's so abnormal from human experience. And there's a pleasure in that experience. When you're standing on a mountainside and you look out at the sunrise, you see that beautiful spectacle of nature that's so vast that makes you feel like you're an infinitesimal speck in the face of something so cosmic, something so beautiful. That moment where you're almost wiped away by the beauty of it, the transcendent moment, is a moment of sublime. And it derives from and produces within you the pleasure of abnormal experience, of the outermost excesses of human emotion and experience. Now, a more formal definition of this idea of the sublime in the Romantic work is that in aesthetics, the sublime is the quality of greatness, whether physical, moral, intellectual, metaphysical, aesthetic, spiritual, or artistic. The term especially refers to a greatness beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement, or imitation. But it's still that feeling that the artist in the Romantic movement sees and experiences and wants to try as best as possible to emulate or to mirror. Gothic literature evolves as an outgrowth of Romanticism, and it tries to grapple with that experience of the sublime, of the fantastical, of things beyond our experience by way of horror. These stories are defined by mystery and labyrinthine secrets, an experience of transcendence beyond the norm in the context of narratives that are meant to provoke and produce horror. So when you're reading a work of Gothic horror, you're looking for that same experience or a similar experience to the sublime of awe and, in a sense, terror, because awe is both wonder and also terror in the face of something that's so much vaster than anything you can understand. Here, in the Gothic tradition, you're looking at that same experience, but it's commingled with horror. Supposedly, it's returned to classical modes of grappling with feeling, like those that we see in the medieval period. The article that I ask you to take a look at now is a short summary of major themes in Gothic literature. There are 5 such themes, although of course there are many more, but these are the 5 that we'll be focusing on. And I want you to take or pay specific attention to 4 of them. So read that article on the fear of otherness, the return of the repressed and fear of historical reversals, the nature of the beast, monsters are us, and the history of madness. These are all concepts in Gothic literature and in, well, monster making that we'll be taking a look at as we go through this course. What I'd like you to do is pause this video and read through the assigned text in the Distributed Documents tab, Major Themes in Gothic Literature. Summarize the points in each of these sections, and then try to find examples. If you know horror films or if you've seen or read something that is similar to a concept that you have been exposed to in this document, I would like you to try to draw that out and think about it in the terms of the technical theory that we're developing from this article. Summarize the points, and then I would like you to watch the next video in this lecture series where I break down each of these core concepts and elaborate a little bit while providing some examples. So, again, read through that article in the Distributed Documents tab, and then watch the next video in this video lecture series.